Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Bipartisan Policy Center for this 7th webinar in our series, Getting Serious About Housing Supply. My name is Dennis Shea. I'm the Executive Director of BPC's J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. The Terwilliger Center was founded to advance the goal of a decent, safe, and affordable home for every American family. No doubt about it, this past year has been a dizzying one for housing. We have seen rents literally go through the roof, with increases as high as 30 to 40% in some markets. Home prices too have soared over the past year, but are now dipping a bit in some areas of the country. With the Federal Reserve combating inflation, we've seen mortgage rates go up, then dip, and then go up again, with rates now approaching 6%. More recently, we have seen perplexing data about rising housing inventory and declining housing starts. So what are we supposed to make of this very confusing picture, and what does it mean for housing affordability? To help us understand what's really going on in the housing market, we are joined by two outstanding experts. Jeff Tucker is the senior economist for Zillow and a master of Zillow's industry-leading real estate database. His research interests include household formation, home ownership, and housing supply. Jeff, who received his master's degree in economics from the University of Washington, will share his insights on the for-sale single-family market. Caitlin Shagru-Walter is vice president for research at the National Multifamily Housing Council, with primary responsibility for conducting NMHC's research on apartment industry trends. Caitlin, who holds a PhD in planning, governance, and globalization from Virginia Tech, will explain what's going on in the rental side of the housing market. We're going to kick things off with short presentations from Jeff and Caitlin before turning to Q&A. At any time, please feel free to add a comment or question in the chat if watching live on YouTube, or tweet at BPC_bipartisan or using hashtag BPC Live. So to start us off, let's go to Jeff.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Dennis. It is fantastic to be here. I am thrilled to hear that there is such interest at the federal level, and we've seen plenty of interest at the state level at finally getting serious about expanding housing supply. I think this has been a festering issue, a sort of building, simmering concern for really all the way back to about 2010 or 2012. And I wish we could have had more housing supply coming into the pandemic-induced changes in the housing market. But the best time to get going on problems that is still available to us is to get started now. So sooner rather than later. So again, I'm thrilled to have a chance to share Zillow's outlook on the state of the housing market with a bit of perspective on kind of what we just went through, what the market is doing right now this summer, and what that may mean is coming up next. All right, so the executive summary here is that we've had 2 years of red hot growth of home prices and demand in the housing market. That has pushed unaffordability to truly a crisis stage. That means buyers are getting discouraged. It means that in turn means that sales volume has begun to fall. That's leaving more homes sitting on the shelf. That's what we call rising inventory. You open up Zillow, you see a lot more homes available for sale than you did this spring. And ultimately, that is causing prices to plateau or even begin to decline in some parts of the country. Now, the super recent update of the last few weeks is we might be looking at kind of a standoff where sellers are asking for more than buyers are bidding, willing to really pay for homes at the moment. So just for some perspective on the affordability challenge, this is the typical mortgage payment to get a fixed rate 30-year mortgage if you've got a 20% down payment on the typical valued home in the country. According to our estimates, that's now up around $350,000. And what happened to homebuyers this spring was this 1-2 punch of both dramatic home price appreciation and a rapid rise in mortgage rates. So that pushed the typical mortgage payment to go get that typical home from right around $1,000 a month up to $1,600 in the span of just 12 months. This is unprecedented. We've almost never seen anything like this before. It's an astonishingly rapid change in the landscape of affordability for home buyers. To step back a bit and ask, how did we get here? So part of the story is what's happened over the course of the pandemic is that increase in home prices. Nationally, our price index is up about 45% from July 2019. And that's starting from a point where a lot of people were already worried about how expensive homes had gotten. When you look around the country, some regions like the Southeast, the Sun Belt, and the Southwest really stand out for having the most home price appreciation. So in some of these markets like Austin and Phoenix, Boise is up there as well, home prices are up about 75% from this time in the summer before the pandemic. At the other end of the spectrum, even in kind of cooler markets on the East Coast and the Midwest, places like Baltimore, Chicago, Minneapolis, home prices have still cumulatively risen close to 30% in the last 3 years. So there's really no part of the country that is immune to the increase in home purchase costs. Now, what is the sort of effect that we've seen most dramatically so far this summer is that home sales have fallen dramatically. This is the annualized rate of existing home sales. It has plunged back to levels even lower than in any of the months in the recent years leading up to the pandemic. After having a bit of kind of a frenzied level of too much activity, maybe in 2021, everyone was sort of stimulated to get into the market when interest rates were under 3% for many 30-year borrowers. Now the pendulum's swinging back the other direction. And what this means is a whole lot of buyers are just discouraged. They can't afford, or they don't see anything that really fits their budget to go buy a home today at these higher prices with these higher mortgage rates. What is that actually finally doing to prices? Well, so this is it's a fairly erratic chart, but this is showing the monthly change in home prices, and it tells a bit of a story of the recovery from the Great Recession. You also can see the decline in the midst of the Great Recession, the Great Financial Crisis. That's when home prices dropped pretty dramatically. We had a wave of foreclosures. But really, since 2012, the market had this very steady rebuilding of home values. And frankly, there wasn't much going on. It was the same story year after year of this kind of slow but steady rise in home values. And then you can see this kind of twin peaked spike of growth where we had some months where prices rose 2% nationally in a single month. That has now come to an end. That was that kind of sharp run up in prices in the last 2 years, driven by some of that intensified demand in the pandemic. And now prices have approximately flatlined. They even ticked it down a little bit in July on our national price index. That is almost entirely just a product of the demand side of the equation. We're seeing buyers pull back. This is entirely different, frankly, from the 2007, 2008 drop in home values, which was supply driven. That was a lot of forced sellers, people who got teaser rates on their mortgages who then had to sell or they were foreclosed on by their banks. Right now, we're near record lows for foreclosure as well as delinquency on mortgages. Zooming in again to kind of regions of the country, we can see that still the Southeast, led by Florida, is still actually seeing very rapid home price appreciation in the last month or so. But some of the markets that were the biggest leaders of the pandemic home price boom, places like Austin and smaller markets as well that didn't make this list, like Boise, they've had some of the quickest reversal of home price gains. These were markets where there was, frankly, a frenzy of activity of people willing to go into multiple offer situations and try to outbid each other. So some of those markets are on a bit of a course correction. The other big takeaway here is the West Coast markets, including my home here in Seattle, and certainly the Bay Area and other places in California are seeing a bit of a cool down because they are more interest rate sensitive. We saw they were more interest rate sensitive back in 2019, and we're confirming it again right now, that when interest rates rise, these markets cool off disproportionately. All right, so that's like the price picture. And Dennis, I'm glad you already spoke about the inventory situation. So I think of inventory as the barometer of the housing market. It helps to reflect the balance between supply and demand. If a whole lot of people want to sell their homes and they're having trouble finding buyers, we should see that inventory rise substantially. Now, there's always a seasonal pattern to the level of listings in the market, that level of inventory. So you can see on this chart, the 2019 line shows maybe what a normal year for inventory looked like before the pandemic. It kind of rises in late summer, but it's up over 1 million homes for sale in any given week. We plunged to a record low in spring of this year, of 2022, and we've begun to climb back. So this was part of that story of this summer price declines beginning, or sort of demand pulling back. It left more homes on the shelf, began to build up a little bit of negative price pressure from sellers feeling that pressure to maybe cut their price to actually get an offer on their home. But that has kind of petered out. We are not skyrocketing back up to 2019 levels of inventory. And in fact, we're petering out closer to maybe half of the level of inventory we would expect. So this is the number one chart I would take a look at to ask, are we on a runaway path toward falling home prices or a glut of homes for sale? And the answer seems to be no. We're not doing that. We're looking for kind of a new equilibrium, but it's not sort of a runaway train headed for suddenly more affordable homes. Another way of looking at that is to ask, for every home on the market, how long did it take to actually go pending? How long did it take for that seller to accept an offer? We hit a record low for that as well this spring, when the median nationwide pending home sale only took 5 days. So all these folks listing a home on Thursday, they've accepted an offer by Tuesday. That is over now. We're now back to about 2 weeks, 14 days for the median home to go pending. Once again, that's still about twice as fast as the comparable time for this time of year before the pandemic. So if you're out there shopping for a home, yes, it's not as intense as the competitive environment in February or March this year, but it's still a very fast-moving, difficult time to buy a home without a whole lot of homes available for sale. So when we try to put all this competing information together of demand stepping back in the face of affordability challenges, inventory rising but not skyrocketing, what our model suggests looking forward, the yellow part of this chart is our forecast for home price growth over the next several months, is that prices probably will dip seasonally for the remainder of the year, and then have a bit of a seasonal bounce back in the spring, climbing a little bit again. And broadly, it's looking like a bit of a seasonal plateau of sort of flat, but with some seasonal growth here and there. And when I tell this to my friends who are trying to buy their first home, a lot of folks in the millennial generation, I think, are hoping for a dramatic price plunge, or really expecting one at this point when you see some of the media headlines. And our model suggests that that's not really in the cards, because fundamentally, there's still not enough homes to go around for all the people who want to buy one. We are at this sort of interest rate driven pullback in demand that's still leaving millions of 30-somethings out there who are at that prime time of trying to form their own household, buy their first home, get into home ownership, and they still don't have a lot of options to choose from, and they're all still very, very expensive. So that's my takeaway from this, and thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to the discussion and to seeing what Caitlin has to say about the rental market.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Jeff, for that really interesting and precise presentation. I'll just turn it over to Caitlin now, who will talk about the rental side of the housing market. Caitlin?
Thanks, Dennis, and thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I have the same conversation with my millennial friends. They're waiting for this price drop. I don't think it's going to emerge. Taking something that Jeff said, there are not enough homes to go around. That's true on the for sale side, and it's also true on the rental side. So if we could pull up my slides, please. I'm going to get started talking about the multifamily rental market, talking about supply and demand, and kind of explaining the underlying factors of how we've gotten to where we are. Dennis mentioned in his introduction the rents that are going through the roof, as high as 30% in some places. And that is true. We have seen double-digit rent growth. Here it's tracked by RealPage, which is a data provider for professionally managed apartments. They've seen double-digit rent growth every quarter since the second quarter of 2021. We saw this past quarter in 2022, we saw an increase of 14.5% year over year. So quite significant increases. Some of the 2021 double-digit rent growth could be attributed to the declines we saw in 2020 during the pandemic when people were nervous. A lot of rental providers had temporarily frozen rent rates. And so some of that was made up in 2021, but we've since surpassed that. And this is due largely in part to the fact that we just don't have enough apartments to go around. And why is that? One of the things that's really been impacting us is the population migration. It was some trends that were already happening before the pandemic seem to have accelerated. So places like Texas and Florida saw a lot of increase in population during the pandemic. And so that was due in part to teleworking. So it remains to be seen whether or not teleworking, how that will shake out. Some folks seem to be requiring their workers to come back in part-time. Some are fully remote work. So while we wait for that to sort itself out, that is creating demand in some of these places where folks can work remotely and have the quality of life that they desire. And so it has moved some places that traditionally we would have thought as more affordable markets. It has moved them to becoming more unaffordable. So looking at that, we worked with our sister organization, the National Apartment Association, to commission some research on the apartment demand that we're going to be needed by 2035. And the research did take into account the pandemic patterns. And it found that 600,000 units are needed currently at a variety of price points, that's apartment units, to deal with the existing shortage. It is a bit of an improvement from where we were a few years ago when construction had basically stopped during the housing crisis of 07-08 with the millennials coming online into their prime renting ages. So we were underbuilding for quite a few years for that demand. So we've gotten better, but we still have an existing shortage of about 600,000 units. And in addition to that 600,000 units that we essentially need to build now, we're going to have an additional 3.7 million units that will need to be built by 2035. 1.5 million of those just located in Texas, Florida, and California alone. And so Texas and Florida, it might be somewhat easy to build, but California, there's a lot of impediments to being able to build there, which I'm sure we'll get into in our discussion. We have seen absorption of new apartments leasing downturn in Q2, but we're still at historical levels if you take the 4-quarter rolling average. So demand for apartments has been quite strong during this post-pandemic time. And we have started to see some questions about, are we overbuilding? Primarily because if you look at the number of multifamily units under construction, we've been hitting historic highs in the past few months. I believe we're almost up to 900,000 units under construction. However, that doesn't really match what we're seeing in the starts and completions numbers. And so we've come to the conclusion that this is largely a result of delays in construction timelines. So while it looks like we may be at risk of overbuilding, it's actually these really lengthened construction timelines that are causing these under construction numbers to be so high. And we started doing a survey during COVID that folks found helpful. So we've made it a regular survey. It's a quarterly construction survey. And the majority of respondents to this survey, 85%, they have been experiencing construction delays. It's for a variety of reasons. It can be due to labor shortages, material shortages, or issues with the local jurisdictions being backed up, particularly in this era of heightened construction. And then there are other delays that can cause quite lengthy timeline extensions as well. We did some research with the National Association of Home Builders a few months ago and found that in areas where there's NIMBY opposition, not in my backyard, it adds an average of almost 7.5 months delay to the timeline, and it can increase development costs by 5.6% in terms of price point. So all these things can add on to making the construction timelines quite lengthy. And then one other element, I mentioned that, California is anticipated to have some of the most demand, but it may be difficult to build there. There are some jurisdictions that have regulations that make it so that developers are concerned about even building there. About half of the respondents to the NHB NMHC survey said that they would not, that they would avoid building in jurisdictions with an inclusionary zoning ordinance. And then 88% said they would avoid building in places where there's a rent control ordinance. And we saw that happen most recently in St. Paul, where development essentially stopped once the rent control ordinance came into effect. And so that has an impact on affordability as well, because we have these needed units that aren't occurring or aren't being built. So I like to think of the affordability crisis as a bunch of puzzle pieces where we need to put all the puzzle pieces back together in order to actually solve the problem. And right now we have a whole bunch of puzzle pieces that just aren't working correctly. It's expensive and lengthy to build. We aren't necessarily building where we need to, and obviously that's showing up through the rent growth. With that, I will turn it back over to Dennis.
Well, thank you very much, Caitlin, for those important insights. As a reminder to our audience, please feel free to add a comment or question in the chat if watching live on YouTube, or tweet at BPC_bipartisan or using hashtag BPC Live. Let me start with a few questions, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion, and perhaps we'll get some questions from the audience in the meantime, which we hope to take up. I would be remiss if I did not mention the R word. I mean, the recession. Recently, the chief economist for the National Home Association of Home Builders stated tighter monetary policy from the Federal Reserve and persistently elevated construction costs have brought on a housing recession. I was wondering, I've read other things recently that it seems to be a story that we're in a housing recession over the past couple of weeks. The story has been circulating. So I was wondering, do you agree? What is a housing recession? And if there is a recession, how are things different today than they were back in 2007 and 2008? Jeff, why don't you pick that up and then go to Caitlin? This is for you both.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an interesting term. And so I go and look at the definition of a recession, which is a broad, sustained downturn in economic activity. And in some ways, that is happening within the housing sector. So if your job is related to the volume of transactions that happen, meaning you're a real estate agent, maybe an appraiser or a loan officer for a mortgage lender, or if you are a home builder, all of those folks are seeing less economic activity, fewer home sales, new and existing. So there's less activity happening in that market. But as you allude to the 2007 to 2009 housing crash and recession, I think a lot of people, when they hear housing recession, might think this is a full economy recession triggered by the housing market. And I don't see anything like that in the cards. That was the transmission mechanism. There was a credit crisis brought on by mortgage foreclosures and really driven by really bad lending in the early to mid 2000s. And we're really in the just polar opposite situation right now, where recent home buyers had sterling credit, delinquencies and foreclosures are near record lows. And broadly, homeowners are actually in pretty good shape. A lot of them have very low and affordable mortgage payments because they locked them in over the last few years. And almost everyone under the sun was getting fixed rate mortgages. So I see very little risk of that kind of credit crisis, which I think is probably what a lot of people might think when they hear housing recession. So it's an interesting new term, but I think we need to be really careful about defining it and exactly what it means.
Yeah, I would add a couple points. I think that on the multifamily side, it's a matter of weeks. If you look at second quarter data for sales transaction volumes, for example, it's record setting. And then we had our sentiment survey in July that had sales volume, our index went down quite tremendously. and so indicating declining conditions. So when I think of recession, I think of, as Jeff said, a prolonged period. And then on the multifamily side, we don't, our construction numbers still seem to be holding up. So in terms of the technical definition of recession, I don't see it, but I guess if similar to what Jeff said, if levels are receding, I guess I could see that.
Well, thank you both for clearing that up. Listening to you both, I think you both agree that we have a structural deficit of homes, both for rent and for sale, which probably began during the Great Recession, 2000, 2008, when construction activity just declined precipitously. We've been slowly inching up. And even with this downturn in housing, or even with more housing inventory, we still don't have a glut of housing on the market. So I would like you to both get your thoughts. Do we still have, do you agree we have a structural deficit of homes that has built up over 15 or so years? And secondly, even with, you look on this is for Katie, you look on the apartment side, the multifamily side, all the construction now is happening, it seems, according to Harvard Joint Center, at the higher end, not at the low or middle end. And for Jeff, there's really a paucity, a shortage of starter homes, entry-level homes for people to get into the first rung of home ownership. So let me toss that question out to both of you for your comments. Caitlin, why don't you go first now?
Okay. So yeah, we've seen, particularly in the aftermath of the Great Recession, this shift to a lifestyle renter who tend to be higher income. So there has been a lot of demand for higher rental units, higher priced rental units. But that coincided also with the underbuilding. And so what we actually had happen was a reverse filtering process where units got more expensive because we were short units. And then obviously we have the issue on the for sale side now where there aren't enough units. If you're someone who is likely to be thinking about purchasing a home, you're likely trending towards the higher income level. And so that's creating demand at the higher level as well. And then we have the finance issue on the construction side where we have so many high construction costs that makes it difficult to build anything except for to the higher rent levels. So luckily we have demand there, but it kind of leaves everybody else in the lurch.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think we've seen a few very detailed studies on this now that are all reaching the same conclusion, that we are structurally underbuilt to the tune of at least a few million homes. And it is that cumulative deficit built up from the home building industry really shutting down and staying shut down for several years in the Great Recession. And I think one way of looking at that I've done as well is to kind of look at all the households that haven't been formed, where if you just look back at maybe back in the 90s or the early 2000s, you took a certain number of 30 somethings, 40 somethings, 50 somethings, how many of them would have a place of their own, would become a household head, and apply that to today's population, we should have 4, 5, maybe 6 million more households than we actually do. So one way that this transmits into the actual experience for folks is kind of doubling up. It's needing to get a roommate instead of having a place of your own. It's those boomerang college kids moving back in with their parents for several years and kind of putting off a lot of life stages. So Americans are still squeezed in and not able to kind of fulfill their American dream of having a place of their own, whether it's owned or rented. Everyone's kind of being squeezed into less space. And frankly, I think that actually got that deficit relative to where people want to be actually got worse in the last couple of years, because I think the experience of the pandemic has increased people's appetite to have a place of their own, or their need to have, a spare bedroom to take Zoom calls like I'm doing right now, to have a home office. A lot of people need a place of their own with that spare bedroom. So that's actually kind of further expanding that appetite, which means we're actually further away from sort of a balanced level where everyone has sort of the amount of space that they need and can afford. And I think that's part of the story of why prices skyrocketed so much in the last year.
So in other words, after the Great Recession, you had limitations on household formation. People were doubling up. People were not forming their own houses, trying to staying at home with parents. And you had this huge younger cohort of individuals doing that. Now, what I'm hearing both of you say is that the pandemic kind of has accelerated the need to branch out and to form your own household and get your own space so you could not just live there, but also work there. Is that a fair assessment? Caitlin, I know you mentioned it in your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely saw an increase in the number of, one units with dens. There's definitely been a desire of folks to have that extra space. And yeah, we are now starting to see a little bit of a return to the doubling up phenomenon as affordability gets worse.
Okay, thank you. What about rising? The other topic I need to mention is the Fed's actions raising federal funds rate, which get reflected into rising mortgage rates. Where do you see that going? How do you see the Fed and the accompanying rise in mortgage interest rates affecting, I'll say, both the for sale and the rental markets? Jeff, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think if there was one clear takeaway from the Fed commentary coming out of Jackson Hole meeting, it was that they're really determined to stay the course and tighten monetary policy until inflation gets under control, which could take a while. We also know they have this long-term plan to wind down the Fed balance sheet. So setting aside this question of that overnight Fed funds rate, the Fed has trillions of dollars in mortgage-backed securities and 30-year treasuries that they want to unwind after they bought hundreds of billions of them early in the pandemic. So the effect of that is to continue to keep upward pressure on mortgage rates. It's very hard to predict. I don't have a crystal ball. The one I had broke in March 2020 and gave up on making a new one. But from all the factors I look at, it's mostly risk to the upside. I can mostly see things like that, the MBS wind down as so the balance sheet shrinking for the Fed as really only reasons to fear further upward pressure on mortgage rates. What does that mean for housing? It continues to make homeownership very unaffordable because those low mortgage rates were really the sort of drawbridge across the moat of high prices that helped still get people in to fairly expensive homes, but at an affordable monthly payment back in 2021. And now that drawbridge is up and a lot of people can no longer cross that moat without the help of low interest rates. And I just don't see them coming back anytime soon.
Caitlin, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I would add, it's not going to help with affordability. Now, if you're an apartment owner trying to get a mortgage or refinance, it makes it more expensive because the debt's more expensive. So yeah, that's going to cause the rent you need to charge to increase. So it's certainly not going to help with affordability. On the demand side, if someone can't buy a house, they're either going to be living at home still with parents or, renting most likely. So that can help with the demand side. But when we're already in a situation where we don't have enough apartment units, then that's a double-edged sword.
So from what I'm hearing, rising interest rates make home ownership less affordable. Rising mortgage rates, home ownership becomes less affordable. That should lead to greater rental demand and that's a problem because you don't have enough supply to meet the demand that already exists. So do you foresee, at least nationally, rents continuing to rise over the next 6 months or so?
Well, we don't officially forecast. That's our rule. But I would say that I don't see any rent declines in the cards. I think that the expectation is that hopefully things will moderate, but definitely rent growth to continue.
Right. Well, I'm going to stick with you, Caitlin. You mentioned in your presentation the study that NMHC did with the home builders, and that study reported that 40% of multifamily housing project costs stem from regulatory compliance. And so which regulations seem to exact the greatest costs, and what steps can government officials at all levels of government take to reduce these costs without adversely impacting health, safety, and other important priorities?
Yeah, so first disclaimer is some regulations are necessary for health, safety of the residents and the stability of the property. But so the largest line item was actually changes in the building code in the past 10 years, complying with those changes. And not all of those have to deal with safety rationale. So that was the biggest line item. Some other things that that came across were, design features that are necessary by that are required by local jurisdictions. One example is requiring a brick facade so that it goes with the community character, but it's not necessary. So what I like to say as a trained urban planner is, it's the local jurisdictions really should take a look at what they're requiring of developers, both at the local level, what the developer is going to have to comply with at the state level and at the national level, because a lot of these regulations can be duplicative. So if there's a way that they can help alleviate those issues, that will help defray the cost.
Okay, thank you. We have some audience questions, and I'll take the first one. More of a policy-oriented question. How can state and local governments collaborate with the federal government in increasing housing supply? Are public-private partnerships warranted? Anybody want to take that? Jeff, you want to take that and then go to Caitlin?
I think the most important step, kind of the most low-hanging fruit, comes from getting out of the way of builders, of reducing some of that red tape, some of those regulations and costly hurdles that Caitlin was just describing, many of which, there are many regulations on the single family home and owner occupied side of the market as well. I'd talk about single family zoning, and frankly, even within single family zoning, minimum lot sizes, saying, you can't have a house unless it also comes with 1/4 of an acre of land. That is going to guarantee that you end up with fewer homes on the land that you have buildable. So I think step one is kind of getting out of the way of those of builders in those respects. In terms of policy actions, I think we're seeing a lot of really promising policy changes at the state and local level. California has just successfully passed a whole raft of bills that are making more housing, buildable near transit and under different conditions. Utah has also kind of led the way. So again, this is really a bipartisan issue where we see both red states and blue states taking this seriously. And, frankly, I think, Utah has done a great job at clearing the way to help private builders do what they want to do, which is to meet this overwhelming excess demand for housing by building what customers want. When it comes to public-private partnership, I do think there's still an important role for public policy, whether on the rental side through housing choice vouchers, and certainly on the supply side with helping to low-income housing tax credit and helping to build the financing to construct, say, subsidized or affordable housing for the sector, the segment of renters and owners as well, who can't quite afford market level prices at the moment.
Thank you. Caitlin?
Yeah, I would add, there are two sets of rent burdened households. There are the folks who just are slightly over their 30% rent to income ratio, and that's because they can't afford to move into a Class A unit. They can only afford to live in their Class B because there's not enough supply. And then there are the folks that are just never going to be able to afford to rent and not be burdened without some sort of government assistance. And so I think the easiest solution there is, to fully fund the voucher program and make the changes to it that are necessary to make it more useful to more property owners and managers. So that's one aspect. And then a lot of it are things that would help builders, what Jeff said, get out of the way of the builders, to make it so that they actually can build those, middle income properties. So the middle income housing tax credit. There are a lot of innovative things that are maybe one-offs, but in certain areas, but could still make a sizable dent, like adaptive reuse. We have all these suburban office parks that aren't necessarily sustainable, but there's a green element that you would be reusing the property to turn it into apartments. So there are some opportunities that maybe the federal government can work with state and local areas to incentivize that.
Well, those are two very thorough, fulsome answers. Thank you both for that. We have another question here in the chat Anybody want to comment on the commoditization of housing by the purchase of housing by financial entities like hedge funds and the conversion of owned homes to rentals? Anybody want to comment on that?
I could jump in with my main reaction to this was that the incentive to do that, the incentive for investors to come in and buy homes to rent them out, in large part is driven by how high a rent they can fetch, which is being driven by the scarcity of housing. If those investors look around and see that that in a market, builders could flood the market with competing rental properties, that makes it a much less attractive investment opportunity to go and buy that home and rent it out. My other reaction here is that it turns out when you do the data, there's a much bigger impact on purchases of single family homes to rent them out, really from a whole range of sizes of investors. There are a lot of mom and pop landlords, sort of small property managers managing, a handful or up to 10 rental housing units. So it's sort of a range of different sizes. And then the one other comment on this is that we haven't actually seen a major shift in the share of single family homes that are rented out in the last few years. I think they're certainly, these buyers, these investors are a player in the marketplace. They were in 2021 as well. They're part of the story, but all in all, it doesn't actually add up to much of a shift of the housing stock. We're not seeing a substantial shift of like a noticeably larger fraction of single family homes are rented out today than they even were 2 or 3 years ago. And then finally on that, I have noticed that investor activity is slowing way down this year. So far this year, those higher prices and that higher cost of credit is also discouraging investors at this point. So it may soon be a fairly moot point because that's such a less attractive investment opportunity than it was last year.
The one thing I would add too is we've seen, particularly, it seems like it's come on very quickly in the past year or so, the single family build for rent phenomenon, which is different than a scatter site. I own 2 properties or I own 10 properties in 10 different neighborhoods. The single family build for rent is basically an apartment community, but single family housing. So it's operated very similarly. All your units are in the same neighborhood. You have the same benefits of being able to have a maintenance person or maintenance crew in that one place. But that's a very new phenomenon. I would say even like the past year or so, we've seen that come on.
Well, thank you both for that. We're running out of time. I just thought I'd ask one final question. It's sort of a crystal ball. I know you threw yours out, Jeff, but maybe you can find another one and use it for this question. But as I understand it, the US population is becoming much more demographically diverse, particularly with the growing size of the Hispanic population. At the same time, the overall population is getting older. A greater percentage of Americans, say by 2030, will be 65 or older. How does that affect housing demand and the types of housing that, particularly for older Americans, that would be necessary? Anyone have any comments on that question?
I would say, older households, they tend to rent a lot. You can downsize. You don't have to worry about, keeping up a 4-bedroom house. Obviously, it will be dependent on each household, but with the baby boomers being one of the largest generations, that's quite a bit of demand potentially for apartments and condos if they're located where the folks want to live. In terms of the Hispanic population, if you're talking recent movers to the United States, we did some research that shows that recent movers to the U.S. tend to reside in apartments, at least in the short term, and then the longer they're here, they tend to move towards home ownership. But then you also have, some groups tend to locate with multi-generational households, which would be more demand for single family, I would say.
Jeff?
I think that sums it up well. I do know there's more demand, certainly as folks move from like their 20s and 30s into their 40s and 50s. We do see the demand broadly shift from multifamily to single family homes. And then, as Caitlin said, toward the older ages, which, a lot of the baby boom cohort is moving toward, it starts to sort of boomerang back to multifamily. And when it comes to multi-generational, I do think that's a really interesting story that actually covers a lot of those demographic trends, where, adult kids of older folks are saying, hey, come back and live with us. We're going to buy a house that has an accessory dwelling unit. And you can stay there, you can live with us, and we can help take care of you. Maybe you can help take care of the grandkids. So I think that's an interesting model that's really rising in demand. We're seeing builders respond to that. And finally, that trend of trying to meet that is also just generating a lot more creation of accessory dwelling units. So that extra apartment or backyard cottage that in the longer term is actually sort of weaving in more housing options. And in many, new construction areas is actually some of that only affordable price point, whether you're renting or actually able to buy that ADU. It's usually rented out. That's an interesting trend that is helping to provide a mix of more affordable options. And again, is something where policymakers can do a lot to get out of the way of that and sort of reduce some of the setbacks or parking requirements that sometimes make those infeasible. Because then once you make it feasible, builders are really loving to construct homes with ADUs at the moment.
Well, fantastic. I want to thank both of you for taking the time to be with us today and for sharing your knowledge and insights. And it's been a real education for me, and I'm sure for our viewers. So thank you. A programming note: as part of our Getting Serious About Housing Supply webinar series, we are planning another event on October 25th to discuss the critical issue of homelessness. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you next month. Bye-bye.